Chapter 3. The Master Method. Advaita as the operating principle of the entire system. What the meta-analyses understated there is a sentence in Shankara's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita that changes how you read every other text in the corpus. It appears in the commentary on chapter 13, verse 13, not a famous verse, not one of the major doctrinal statements, not a passage that receives particular attention in the standard scholarly treatments. A working commentary note in the middle of an extensive bhashya. The sentence is this: the entity free of the world is delineated by deliberate negation, superimposition, and subsequent read it twice, then read it again with the word deliberate underlined. Shankara is not saying, sometimes we use provisional language that we later correct. He is not saying, earlier teachings are superseded by later ones. He is announcing a design principle. The provisional language is deliberate. The subsequent negation is deliberate. The installation and withdrawal are both planned, both necessary, both part of the same operation. This is Advaita, and it is not one of Shankara's tools. It is the principle that governs how all of his tools are deployed, at every scale, from the micro level of a single technical term to the macro level of the entire 46-text curriculum. The arch and the frame, the image Shankara does not use, but that best describes the method: a brick arch. An arch, once completed, is self-supporting. The stones hold each other in place through the geometry of the curve. No external support is required, but you cannot build the arch without a wooden frame underneath. You lay the bricks on the frame. Only when the keystone is placed and the arch is complete can the frame be removed. The frame was always going to be removed. It was never part of the arch, but without it, the arch could not have been built. Every technical term in the Advaita corpus is a frame piece. Every framework, the 5 sheaths, the 3 bodies, the 2-tier ontology, the witness self, is a section of wooden formwork, precisely shaped to support the brickwork above it. And when the keystone is placed, when the recognition occurs, every piece of formwork is removed, not because it was wrong, because it served its purpose. But here is the specific feature that makes Advaita different from ordinary provisional pedagogy. The arch is not built once and the frame removed once. The method operates at multiple scales simultaneously. At the macro scale, the entire curriculum is an arch being built. The foundational texts, Tattva Bodha, Vedantasara, Sadhana Panchakam, are the earliest courses of brick, rough, basic, setting the geometry. The middle texts, Vivekachudamani, Panchadashi, the Vartikas, are the higher courses, increasingly refined, closing toward the keystone. The radical texts, Ashtavakra Gita, Avaduta Gita, Ribhu Gita, are the keystone being placed and the entire formwork being removed simultaneously. The student who reaches the Ashtavakra Gita correctly after everything else stands in the completed arch. The student who starts with the Ashtavakra Gita has no arch. They have a keystone sitting on the ground. At the micro scale, each individual text performs the same pattern. The Tattva Bodha installs the categories, Advaita, deploys them to separate the real from the unreal, use of scaffold, and then ends, leaving the reader in a position where the categories can now be set down. The Vivekachudamani installs the witness self as the correct destination. Advaita drives the discrimination to the witness with 580 verses of force, use of scaffold, and then, in its final verses, gestures toward something that the witness itself cannot contain. At the meta-scale, the 2-tier ontology of Paramarthika and Vyavaharika is itself the largest scaffold in the corpus. The distinction between the absolute level, non-dual, no world, no individual, only Brahman, and the empirical level, conventionally individuals, real world, conventional distinctions, is a provisional structure, true within the framework that Avidya creates, designed to dissolve when the framework dissolves. The 2-tier ontology is the last frame before the arch stands on its own. The specific genius of the method is not just pedagogically clever. It solves a genuine philosophical problem that no other approach to non-dual teaching has managed to solve. The problem: how do you teach the recognition of non-duality to someone who is operating from inside a dualistic framework without either A, using dualistic language that reinforces the framework, or B, refusing to use language at all, which leaves the student with nothing to work with? The Zen tradition chose B in its most radical moments: the koans, the refusal to answer, the shout, the blow, effective for some minds, inaccessible to most. The devotional traditions chose God is real, the individual is real, the relationship between them is what matters, effective as spiritual practice, does not ultimately address the root problem. Advaita chooses neither. It uses dualistic language precisely, deliberately, as formwork, installing it with full knowledge that it will be removed, sequencing the installation and removal with surgical precision, and leaving the student in a position where the removal is not experienced as loss but as arrival. The witness self is a dualistic concept. There is a witness subject, and there is what is witnessed object. Using the witness self as a teaching tool technically reinforces the subject-object split. But the Advaita method uses it precisely because of this. The student identifies with the witness self, which immediately reveals that the subject-object split is still operative, which then makes the phase 3 operation available. The split has been elevated to a level where it can be directly investigated, and direct investigation reveals it has no substance. You needed the frame to build that particular arch. You needed to identify as witness before you could investigate the witness. You needed to find that the witness has no edges before the expansion into the infinite could occur. The dualistic formwork was not a concession or a compromise. It was the engineering solution. The corpus, as distributed scaffold, now look at the 46 texts as a single system from this perspective. The corpus divides into 3 functional phases, not because the texts are labeled this way, but because the Advaita structure runs at the macro scale and produces 3 recognizable stages of formwork. Phase 1 texts, Advaita, the installation of categories. The vocabulary texts, Tattva Bodha, Vedanta Sara, give the student the instruments they need to perform the first operation. The practice texts, Sadhana Panchakam, Atma Bodha, prepare the cognitive instrument itself, quieting the habitual noise of the body-mind complex enough that the operations can be performed clearly. Without this preparation, the operations produce intellectual understanding rather than direct recognition. You understand what the corpus means without performing what the corpus requires. Phase 2 texts, maximum deployment. The full force of the subject-object split and the criteria swap, delivered with every available technique. The discrimination texts, Vivekachudamani, Drg Drishya Viveka, Aparakshanabhuti, perform the operations directly. The scholastic texts, Advaita Siddhi, Khandana Khandakadya, close every logical escape route, every position from which the mind could retreat from the recognition. The Upanishadic commentaries anchor the entire operation in Shruti, not for institutional authority, but because the Upanishads encode the operations in their most compressed and direct form, and Shankara's commentaries deploy that compression correctly. Phase 3 texts, withdrawal of scaffolding. The Vartikas of Shusvara apply the same analysis to Shankara's Siddhantabindu own and frameworks. Kaivalya, the Navanita, compress the recognition into its simplest form. The radical Gitas, Ashtavakra, Avadhuta, Ribhu, perform the final Apavada. Every framework is removed, including the framework of having performed operations, including the framework of a student who needed operations, including the framework of a teacher who provided them. Each phase is necessary. Phase 1 without Phase 2 is vocabulary without deployment. Phase 2 without Phase 1 is force without instrument. The student cannot perform the operations clearly because the cognitive instrument has not been prepared. Phase 3 without Phase 2 is the keystone without the arch. The student hears, there is no path and no practitioner, and either agrees abstractly, which is not the recognition, or is confused. Phase 3 with Phase 2 is the completed arch having its formwork removed. The Upadshasahasri on the mechanism, the Upadshasahasri, the Thousand Teachings, one of the few texts scholars accept as almost certainly by Shankara's own hand, contains the most explicit technical description of how Advaita operates in live teaching. The text describes the teacher-student interaction in precise terms. The student arrives with a self-concept. The teacher does not attempt to destroy the self-concept directly that would produce confusion or nihilism. Instead, the teacher installs a more refined self-concept. Not you are the body-mind, but you are the awareness witnessing the body-mind. This is the Advaita, a provisional attribution that is more accurate than what the student currently holds. The student stabilizes in the new position. Then the teacher withdraws. Not the student. The teacher withdraws the framework the student was just given. The awareness witnessing the body-mind implies a witness and a witnessed, but the awareness that was present in deep sleep was not witnessing anything. There was nothing to witness. Yet awareness was present, so the witness structure is itself a conditional appearance. The awareness is prior to the witness structure. The adhiropa of the witness is now available for a pavada. This withdrawal is not a retraction. It is a complete. The student stabilized as witness needed that stabilization to discover that the witness has no substance. You cannot dissolve a position you never occupied. The adhiropa was the method of arriving at the position. The apavada is the method of discovering what is left when the position is released. What is left is not nothing. What is left is what was present before the witness position was installed. Anywhere, pure not awareness, watching not anything, located not a perspective. The invariant. Why this matters for reading the corpus, understanding adhiropa pavada as the master method rather than one tool among many changes, how every text in the corpus should be read. The foundational preliminary. Adhiropa the texts are precisely specific, not merely calibrated vocabulary and categories required to perform the phase 2 operations. Read them as precision installations, not as introductions to a topic. The middle texts are not merely complex. They are maximum force deployment of the phase 2 operations, using every available technique to move the student's reference frame to the witness position. They should be read not for their philosophical conclusions, but for their operational effect on the reader's attention. The radical texts are not alternatives to the system or shortcuts around it. They are the apavada phase, the removal of everything the phase 1 and phase 2 texts installed. They should be read last, after everything else, by a mind that has been through everything else. Read in this sequence, they are the most liberating texts in the corpus. Read without the sequence, they are either incomprehensible or dangerous, the appearance of a shortcut that bypasses the very preparation that makes the recognition possible. The Upanishads are the culmination, not the foundation. They encode the operations in their most compressed and direct form. They should be approached after the curriculum has prepared the reader to receive them. The Mahavakyas are not philosophical propositions to be understood. They are delivery the corpus's systems, highest compression sentences designed to perform operations 1 and 2 simultaneously in a mind prepared to receive them. And the Brahma Sutras, Badarayana's compressed systematization of the Upanishadic teaching, are the meta-framework that holds the entire adhiropa in place. Their function is not to provide arguments for non-duality. Their function is to demonstrate that the Upanishads, read correctly, all point to the same operation. The systematization is itself an adhiropa at the largest scale. Here is the complete framework of Vedantic teaching. Now engage with it until the framework is no longer needed. The thing that should disturb you, if you have been following the argument of this chapter carefully, you have arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion. Spec is an adhiropa. Every analytical framework deployed in the following chapters, the 3 operations, the phase classification, the scope and category analysis, the Minto pyramid structures, is provisional, installed to move you from where you are reading about Advaita Vedanta to where you need to be performing the operations the texts describe, and then removable when that move is complete. The corpus is not the recognition. The analysis of the corpus is certainly not the recognition. Both are pointers, maps not territory, delivery systems not what is being delivered, but this is precisely the point. The corpus was designed to be engaged with knowing it is a scaffold, not bypassed because it is a scaffold, engaged with fully and then released. The student who uses the tattva bodha as a definitive ontological account of reality has mistaken the formwork for the arch. The student who dismisses the tattva bodha because it is merely provisional has missed the point of the formwork entirely. You build the arch with the frame, you stand in the completed arch, you remove the frame. In that order, Part 2 follows the Phase 1 texts, the vocabulary installers, the first operations, the initial preparation of the cognitive instrument. The next 3 chapters are the formwork going up. Keep the arch in mind. Part 2, the vocabulary. Installers.